Welcome to a place where silence speaks, eyes linger, and souls awaken. This is where true love stories come alive. Here we tell what no one dares to say, the quiet heartbreak inside a long marriage, the touch that didn't start with lust but with presence, the glance that reached deeper than skin, and the kind of love that feels more like remembering than discovering. These are stories of longing, of guilt that couldn't silence truth, of women who weren't looking, but were found, and when the body finally answered the ache, it wasn't about desire alone. It was about being seen. Really, truly seen. If you've ever felt invisible in a life that looks perfect, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we peel back the layers of routine to uncover raw, emotional truth. Because sometimes the most forbidden stories are the ones that save us. It used to feel like love, or maybe it was love once, long ago, before the years blurred the edges, before the affection turned into tasks and the passion into schedules. Back when small glances carried meaning and fingertips spoke whole sentences in silence. But now everything just feels quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that echoes when a soul has been left alone too long. There's a loneliness no one ever talks about, the one that exists inside a marriage that still functions. Bills are paid, groceries are bought, there are dinners and conversations about the kids or the house or the neighbors. It all looks fine from the outside, even sounds fine to those listening in from a distance, but something inside is missing, something vital, and over time, when that something isn't fed, it begins to wither. There are moments when the silence feels louder than words ever could, the kind of silence that creeps into a room where two people sleep inches apart, yet feel miles away, breathing the same air but not sharing it. Eyes might meet in passing, but there's no warmth behind them anymore, just the dull flicker of habit. The touch of a hand once meant safety, desire, a connection, but now it feels like a reflex, a mechanical motion performed out of duty, not devotion. And when the days pile up like that, one after another, the soul begins to shrink a little. At first, it doesn't seem like much, just small things, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a dinner where the silence stretches too long, a night where one turns off the light before the other even makes it into bed. But slowly, gently, those small things begin to build a wall, not out of anger, not out of resentment, just distance. Sometimes late at night, there's a whisper inside that asks, "Is this all there is?" But it's a quiet voice buried beneath layers of guilt and loyalty. That voice doesn't scream, it doesn't demand. It simply wonders, and then it retreats because it knows it isn't safe to speak too loud in a life built on long promises. The hardest part isn't the fights, it's the absence of them, the absence of emotion altogether. Indifference where there should be fire. Numbness where there used to be touch. The body can stay for years, even when the heart has packed up and left. And when love becomes an arrangement rather than a connection, the emptiness can feel more suffocating than solitude ever could. There were days filled with routine. Wake up, get dressed, smile across the table, talk about errands, say good night, repeat, and in between there were echoes. Echoes of who we used to be. Echoes of how it felt to be wanted, to be looked at like something rare, to be touched like something sacred. Those echoes don't leave, they just grow fainter, until one day they're not echoes anymore. They're ghosts, and yet everything still looks intact. That's the cruel trick of emotional starvation. It doesn't leave marks, it doesn't bruise or bleed, it just hollows. It eats away at the inside, quietly, politely. No one sees it coming because everything looks normal, perfect, even, but deep inside, the soul begins to ache for something it can't even name. It wasn't about wanting something more exciting. It wasn't about chasing fantasy or burning bridges. It was about wanting to feel real again, to feel seen, to feel like the heart beating inside still mattered to someone. Not because of history, not because of vows, but because of presence, because someone chose to see it, to touch it, to listen to it. There's a kind of grief that comes with staying, a grief that wraps itself around the soul like a cold blanket, whispering that this is as good as it gets, that it's too late to want more, too selfish to reach for something deeper. But that grief lies, because wanting to be touched with meaning, wanting to be looked at like something beautiful, wanting to be spoken to with tenderness, that isn't selfish. That's human. And still the days continued, and the nights passed, and the silence grew. No anger, no betrayal, just a quiet drifting. And sometimes the worst part of it all was knowing that no one did anything wrong. No cruelty, no harm, just the slow erosion of something sacred, until all that was left were motions without meaning. Not all hunger is physical. Some of it is deeply emotional. And when the soul is hungry long enough, it begins to ache. Not loudly, not violently, just deeply, a longing that curls into the bones, a desire not just to be touched, but to be understood, to be remembered, to be held in the places that no one else can see. And when that hunger is left unfed, it doesn't just fade. It festers quietly, invisibly, until one day something cracks, not because of weakness, but because something inside finally whispers, I need more than this. Not more chaos, not more excitement, just more truth, more warmth, more presence, because sometimes what breaks a heart isn't betrayal. It's being forgotten in plain sight. It's being invisible in the place where you were once everything. And when that happens, something shifts, not loudly, but permanently. It didn't feel wrong. It didn't feel wild or reckless or anything that would match the stories whispered behind closed doors. It felt quiet, soft, almost too gentle to name at first, like the brush of wind before a storm, something stirring under the skin, not loud enough to startle, but deep enough to make the heart turn toward it. And there he was. He wasn't supposed to matter, just someone younger, someone passing through, a part of a world that had nothing to do with mine. But the way he looked didn't belong to his age. It belonged to something older than time. The way his eyes paused, held, stayed. It wasn't casual. It wasn't curiosity. It was presence, like he wasn't just seeing the face, but all the stories behind it, every tired laugh, every silent ache. Every piece I thought no one remembered. He didn't flirt, not in the way men do when they want something. He didn't try to charm or convince or play games. He simply stayed, with his gaze, with his questions, with his silence. There's a stillness in some people that makes everything inside you settle. That's what it felt like parts of me I hadn't heard from in years were finally starting to breathe again, just from the way he listened. There was a moment I won't forget, something small, a laugh shared over nothing, something clumsy, unimportant, but the way his eyes lit up, the way he leaned in slightly, as if that sound meant something to him, it caught me off guard. No one had looked at me like that in years, not with amusement or appreciation or want, but with interest, real interest, like I was a book he hadn't finished reading yet, and he wanted to know how the story ended. It would have been easy to dismiss it, to blame loneliness or imagination, or the natural pull of novelty, but it wasn't that. It wasn't about being older and him being younger. It was about how awake he was. How alive he made me feel just by noticing, really noticing the small cracks, the quiet pauses in my voice, the way I looked away when something touched too close to truth. Sometimes he'd ask the simplest things, but they landed differently. What made you smile like that? Or do you still dream about it? And suddenly I'd find myself opening parts of me I hadn't dared to share in a long time, not because I planned to, but because something about the way he asked made it safe. Made it feel like I wouldn't be judged for still feeling alive inside, even after years of being muted. There was a day we sat across from each other, just talking, no agenda, no hurry. His elbow rested on the table, his hand absent-mindedly tracing the rim of his glass. He wasn't trying to impress me. He wasn't trying to prove anything, but the air between us was thick with something unspoken, something gentle and electric all at once, like two pieces of something broken finally recognizing each other. He told me once that people carry rooms inside them, that some are filled with music, and some are filled with silence, and some are filled with locked doors. He said I felt like a library, not loud, not showy. Just full of words, of memories, of meaning. No one had ever described me like that. No one had ever even tried, and that's what he was, a mirror, a spark, a warm, still place where I could hear my own voice again. He didn't try to fix anything. He didn't offer answers. He just held space, and in that space, I came back to life in ways I didn't think were possible anymore. Touch didn't happen quickly. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't even expected. It unfolded like a question, a look, a closeness, a breath shared too long, and when it finally did, it didn't feel like crossing a line. It felt like coming home to a truth that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface. A truth too deep to be explained, too personal to be measured. He never asked for more than I was willing to give, never pushed, never assumed, but his presence alone made something in me ache, not just for the physical, but for the emotional hunger I'd buried for years. The hunger to be known, not for what I do, not for who I've been to others, but for what still lives in the deepest corners of who I am. He reminded me what it felt like to be chosen, not out of obligation, not out of routine, but out of wonder, out of that breathless curiosity that says, I see you, all of you, and I want to stay. I don't know how or why our paths crossed the way they did. I don't know what to name what passed between us, but I know it woke something. Not just desire, but tenderness, hope, the ache of being touched without being touched, the kind of connection that slips past the skin and settles in the heart without asking permission. Not every story comes with a future. Some just come to remind you what it feels like to be alive again, and sometimes that's enough. It was never about chasing something physical, not at first. It was something else, something slower, quieter. It was in the way his presence settled into a room, how his energy didn't demand attention but somehow held it anyway, like the world could keep spinning around him and he'd still find a way to be fully there, fully still. And that stillness pulled something out of the shadows, something that had gone silent a long time ago. There was a moment, small, fleeting, when his hand brushed against the side of her wrist, just skin to skin for barely a second. But it landed differently. It didn't feel accidental. It didn't feel planned. It felt like a pause, like a question he wasn't asking out loud. And something about that touch stayed, not on the skin, but underneath it. The moments came like that, unhurried, undemanding, just real, a conversation stretched into laughter, a shared glance that lingered a heartbeat too long, the way his voice dropped when he asked things that actually mattered. When was the last time you felt really seen? Not casual, not loaded, just sincere, and the body didn't flinch at that question. It softened, it leaned in. It wasn't about filling a void, it was about being met. On equal ground, without armor. And that was the beginning. Not a chase, not a seduction, but a surrender. A slow, aching surrender that didn't begin with lips or bodies, but with trust, with space, with breath. He never tried to impress. He wasn't all charm and flash. He didn't offer big gestures. What he gave instead was steadiness, attention. He made silence feel safe, made stillness feel full. And when he looked, it was like his eyes weren't searching for something he could take, but for something he could hold, gently, honestly. There was something in his nearness that made everything sharper. Colors looked deeper, time moved slower, the ordinary moments started to glow. Sitting beside him felt like standing at the edge of something ancient and waiting, and the longer he stayed, the more that waiting became undeniable. He never reached for more than was offered, but his presence invited something to rise, a hunger, not just for touch, but for connection, to be noticed not as a body, but as a soul wrapped in skin, and somehow he knew how to speak to both at once. Without pressure, without expectation, just presence. The first time his hand rested along the small of a back, it wasn't bold, it was reverent, almost like he was asking permission without words, and the body answered before the mind could. A breath caught, a shiver ran through muscle and memory, not because it had been touched, but because it had been seen, really seen, for the first time in years. When it finally happened, it wasn't a decision. It wasn't planned, it unfolded the way some things are meant to, like water finding the cracks in dry earth, like music swelling in a room that's been silent too long. Every movement was slow, careful, filled with listening. And not the kind of listening that happens with ears, but the kind that happens with hands, with skin, with breath. He didn't rush, didn't reach for more than was needed. His fingers moved like they were remembering something. Not just exploring a body, but honoring it. Like he'd discovered a secret and didn't want to break it. And every inch he touched felt like a part of the past being rewritten. The ache of neglect being undone, stitch by slow stitch. There was no noise in that moment, no chaos, just the sound of breath and heartbeat and the soft murmur of truth. He didn't touch to claim, he touched to connect, to remind, to say, in the language of flesh and feeling, you are still here, you are still worthy of being wanted. And the body responded, not with urgency, but with awe, the kind of awe that comes when something sacred is being returned, a part of the soul that had been buried in routine and silence rising to the surface again, blinking in the light, remembering how it once felt to be alive. To be chosen, to be craved, not just for what was visible, but for what had been hiding underneath all along. Afterward, there were no questions, no awkward shifts, just stillness, just two bodies sharing space, hearts beating in rhythm, the silence finally full instead of empty. And in that stillness, something deeper settled, something more than pleasure, more than passion, something that felt like truth, because what passed between them wasn't just physical, it was sacred, the kind of sacred that happens when someone reaches into the forgotten corners of another's life and turns the lights back on gently, respectfully, fully, and in that glow, everything else faded. Time, age, guilt, rules, none of it mattered. Only the warmth, the knowing, the impossible beauty of being remembered after so long. That night didn't change everything, but it changed something inside, and sometimes that's all it takes. It wasn't supposed to happen, not like that, not in this season of life, not with someone so unexpected. And yet, even now, even after everything, there's no regret. There's guilt, yes, sharp and stubborn. But guilt doesn't undo truth. It doesn't erase what was felt. It doesn't silence the echo of being seen after so many years of being invisible. There's a loneliness that creeps into a life that looks whole. A kind of emptiness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being next to someone and feeling unseen, unfelt, unheard. The world keeps moving. The house stays clean, dinner still gets made, and the marriage stays intact on paper. But inside, a part begins to wilt, slowly, quietly, until one day, it's hard to even remember what it felt like to be touched with meaning. And then, like a whisper through the fog, something arrives. A glance that stays a moment too long, a voice that sounds like warmth, a conversation that stirs something buried deep beneath years of silence. There was no plan, no scheme, just a connection that grew in the stillness, in the spaces where attention had long disappeared. The first time it felt real, there was no kiss, no touch, just a moment, a pause in conversation where he looked, not at the face, not at the clothes, not at the age, but through it all. Like he could see straight into the heart, the one that had been quietly aching for someone to notice it still beat. And in that gaze, something flickered awake. It didn't happen all at once. It came in slow waves. Soft questions, gentle gestures, the kind of presence that doesn't demand but invites, and somewhere in the middle of it, the guilt began to whisper, "This is wrong, this shouldn't be," but louder still was the feeling, unshakable, undeniable, that this was real. It wasn't about chasing youth. It wasn't about fantasy or rebellion. It was about being met, fully, intimately, emotionally. It was about being reminded that a soul doesn't age the same way skin does. That the hunger for connection, for tenderness, for being known, those hungers never die. They just grow quiet, waiting to be awakened, and he awakened it, not with promises, not with flattery, just with presence, with eyes that didn't flinch, with a touch that didn't just skim the surface but listened, with the kind of care that doesn't come often in a lifetime, and certainly not when it's least expected. The first time they came together, it wasn't fireworks. It was something deeper, something raw and tender and almost painful in its honesty. It felt like coming home to a part of herself that had been locked away for decades. The way he touched wasn't about pleasure. It was about reverence, like he wasn't just touching a body, but holding a story, a whole life's worth of silence, grief, longing, and offering it comfort without trying to fix it. Afterward, the mirror looked different. Not because of him, but because something within had shifted. The face staring back wasn't younger. It wasn't more beautiful by the world's standards, but it was alive. The eyes weren't tired. They were lit from the inside. The skin wasn't flawless, but it glowed, and for the first time in a long time, that reflection looked like a woman who had been chosen, not out of duty, not out of obligation, but out of want. The guilt didn't vanish. It lingered, it pressed into the quiet moments and asked hard questions, but it couldn't smother the truth, and the truth was this: what they shared was honest. It was born from real hunger, from silent suffering, from years of being numb. It wasn't reckless, it wasn't cruel, it was careful, aching, and human. Some might call it weakness, some might call it betrayal, but the heart knows what it felt. The body remembers what it's like to be held without fear, without pretense. And the soul remembers being seen, being fully seen, and still being wanted. There were moments in the aftermath that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, wondering what had been risked, what had been broken, but more powerful than the fear was the quiet knowing that, for once, life had stopped feeling like waiting. It had become presence, breath, touch, truth. No promises were made. No futures planned. What existed between them was fragile, temporary, and yet eternal in its imprint. It didn't need to last forever to matter. Some connections are like fireflies, brief, glowing, magical, and gone before the world even notices, but their light stays with you. It changes the way you see the dark. Not everything has to be explained. Not every truth has to be justified. Some are meant to be felt, lived, and remembered. And what they shared, no matter how fleeting, was real. It brought a forgotten soul back to life. It turned stillness into song. It filled silence with breath. And in the quiet that followed, when the world returned to its ordinary rhythm, something inside remained different. Not because of what happened between two people, but because something buried had been touched, not just by hands, but by understanding. And sometimes, being truly seen is the most intimate thing of all. Because the deepest truth wasn't in the moment their bodies met. It was in the moment afterward, standing in front of the mirror, seeing light again, and knowing exactly why. Thank you for watching. If this story touched a place in you that's been silent too long, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe for more true love stories that go deeper than skin, into the longing, the ache, and the quiet beauty of being seen. Like, share, and come back soon. Your story might be next.